Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a stealth-oriented first-person shooter and the follow-up to Sniper Ghost Warrior 3. It was developed and published by CI Games, or City Interactive if you're not familiar with them, and it was released in November of 2019 to a fairly mixed reception, although it did lean a bit more towards the positive than the negative. And from what I've seen, the two biggest complaints were with regards to the amount of technical issues the game launched with, as well as the story. Now, of course, I will go over those a bit later on in the review, but suffice to say, this was an interesting game to see, because Sniper Ghost Warrior has been this series that has just kind of stuck around and nobody's really sure why. It could just be that the market for sniper-oriented games is actually fairly large and just hasn't really been capitalized on outside of course, Sniper Ghost Warrior and Sniper Elite. But the entire series up to Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts has generally been pretty negatively received. I mean, the first game was an absolute disaster. Then the second game came out and it was slightly better, but it was still pretty bad. And then you got to the third game, and it was extremely mediocre at absolute best because it tried way too hard to copy way too many AAA trends, and the developers actually acknowledged this going into Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts. They said that it was a bad idea to try to chase AAA game design with Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, so they dialed it all back into Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts. Were they successful in this endeavor? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out what we're dealing with here, and whether or not the Sniper Ghost Warrior series has finally started to hit its stride. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on CryEngine, and they make pretty good use of the engine. The environments in particular are absolutely fantastic. But even aside from that, it's got rather good modeling, although the character models get very repetitive because you're going to be running across the same basically 2 or 3 soldier types the entire game, and they all basically look exactly the same. So only the unique characters, basically the targets you're sent to eliminate, are going to stand out from the crowd. Unfortunately, though, the animations do leave something to be desired. The first-person weapon handling animations are fine, but the actual character animations are only average at best, and there is no lip syncing at all, so when you're looking at the characters talking, they're basically just nodding their heads, and it looks extremely dated. And sure, that may be a whole lot of work for not a whole lot of benefit, but when you've got something that is as high-end as the CryEngine, and you don't include something like that even on a basic level, it just makes the omission that much more glaringly obvious. Aside from that, though, the rest of the engine's capabilities are pretty well used. It's got some very well done lighting, it's got some nice post-processing effects, the textures are quite good, and they even threw in some extra visual touches to fit more with the sniper theme. For example, the bullet cam, which is something that still looks better in Sniper Elite because you get the X-ray view, but Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts does still have some dismemberment, as well as being able to blow enemies' heads apart, and of course if you throw grenades at enemies or hit the explosive barrels near them, then it will also blast enemies apart, so that does still end up being pretty viscerally satisfying. And if the bullet cam bothers you, then you can actually turn it off entirely, or simply reduce its frequency, or if you really want more of it, then you can increase its frequency, so it's nice that they give you options there. Now, all of that said, even though the game does generally look rather good apart from a few issues here and there, I did notice some performance issues here and there, notably some hitching that seems to occur when the game is loading resources in. Now, it is worth noting I was running this on an SSD, so I'm not sure if that issue would become worse if you were running this on a standard hard drive, but suffice to say, every so often the game will hitch for a few moments, but it will stabilize itself very quickly. It's annoying, but it's certainly not a deal breaker. Now, as far as general frame rates go, I never saw it dip below 60 frames per second apart from those momentary hitches when it was loading stuff in. And even with all of the visuals maxed out, which is what you're seeing here, it was running pretty well at 1080p on my system. Now, admittedly, my system is getting on in years at this point. It's an i7-4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080. But it was more than capable of maxing the game out at my monitor's native resolution of 1080p and getting well above 60 frames per second all the time. Most of the time it was in the 70s, and in certain particularly visually intense areas it would dip down into the 60s themselves, whereas in certain other areas it would go well up into the 90s. So your mileage is going to vary a bit depending on what your own hardware is, And I imagine that the consoles are probably running this at 30 frames per second, but I'm not 100% sure there. But again, apart from those occasional hitches, the game does run quite well. So they've done a very good job with the visuals there. What about the sound design? Well, the soundtrack is basically generic modern action movie soundtrack, so it's not terrible, but it's not good either. In fact, most of the time you even forget it's there. And then there's the sound effects themselves, where it's got some okay gun and explosion sounds. They're not especially beefy, but they do certainly get the job done, and they're certainly better than a lot of others I've heard, so they've at least got a decent thing going there. But then there's the thing that does actually bother me about the sound design, and that is the voice acting. You see, it's entirely in English, and since the game takes place in a fictional Siberian state, you end up with a lot of actors speaking English but trying to put on Russian accents, and it's not always very convincing.
Bratsk, Irkutsk. You have much influence in these cities.
That is true.
You will give them to me.
Frankly, it would be more interesting if the voice acting was entirely in Russian with subtitles rather than in English and just with kind of fakey accents. It's just a bit of a missed opportunity there, unfortunately. But overall, the sound design is certainly competent, it gets the job done, and there's nothing particularly egregious about it, so there's not really a huge amount to complain about there other than some missed opportunities, like I said there. I would again like to see the gun and explosion sounds a bit beefier, more concussive, and have a bit more of that bass kick to them, but what they've got here is certainly decent enough, and it's always something that they can improve in the sequel, which they are working on. But of course, whether they do improve it in the sequel or not, well, we'll just have to wait and see on that. But if you bring all of the presentation for Ghost Warrior Contracts together, you end up with something that actually looks and sounds relatively high-end given the limited budget, and while it certainly doesn't outpace the best-looking and sounding AAA games out there, it can still actually stand shoulder to shoulder with some of those AAA games, so they've definitely done a rather good job with what they had, even though there are a few issues here and there. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as a mercenary codenamed Seeker, who chooses to undertake a series of contracts for a mysterious benefactor with the stipulation that he will use a high-tech suit and mask which enhance his abilities, such as giving him extra fall damage resistance, or even being able to scan things, or tag enemies like you can in a wide variety of games out there, and you can see on your heads-up display exactly where they are. And while the suit and the mask are probably just an excuse for the gameplay mechanics, at least there is actually a story reason for these mechanics existing, and it's not just you're clairvoyant and happen to know exactly where your tagged enemies are. Anyway, he accepts the suit and the mask and goes off to engage in a series of contracts in the fictional Siberian state which has separated from Russia, and which has been involved in some rather gruesome warfare as of late. Seeker ventures off into the country and is given a series of objectives in each mission that can be completed in any order. These objectives range from simply finding evidence of some things, or finding intel, or destroying certain data, or of course eliminating certain targets, and as he continues to complete the objectives, it becomes more obvious that there's a bit more behind the scenes than what he was told, and once the contracts are completed, his handler does say, you know what, you've earned the truth, let me go ahead and lay it out for you. And while I'm not going to spoil the ending for you, I will say that it is a very underwhelming ending, and in fact the story in general is fairly underwhelming, but that's not necessarily that big of a problem, because this game isn't really story-oriented anyway. Sure, the game is linear in the sense that you have individual missions that you need to complete in a specific sequence, and once you get through each of those, the story is revealed further and further until the ending, but the story is really just a framework for explaining what Seeker is doing. It's told mostly in cutscenes that play whenever you start a mission, and it gives you a rundown on who your targets are and what your objectives are, and all the justification you really need for what you're doing is that the targets that you're given are terrible people. They're already guilty of various crimes against humanity and deserve what's coming to them, but they're also up to no good anyway, and what you're being sent in to do is basically disrupt all of their plans. It's really not a complicated story at all, and considering how far in the background it is most of the time, it's not really something you're going to worry about while you're playing it, because what you're actually going to be focusing on is the gameplay. So what is the gameplay of Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts? Well, in a lot of ways, it's the gameplay of Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, but scaled back. Instead of the open world that we saw with Ghost Warrior 3, Contracts actually takes place in a mission structure. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, that makes the game linear. Well, sort of, but not really. Because when you go into a mission in Ghost Warrior Contracts, you are given a series of objectives that you need to complete, but you can complete them in any order that you want, and you have multiple angles of going about any particular objective. Once you've completed at least one objective, then you go to an exfiltration point and have to sit in that exfiltration point for a moment while the data is uploaded, and then you can continue from where you left off and go and complete the other objectives, or if you've completed all of your main objectives, then the mission is considered completed and you go back to the mission select screen. Once you're at that screen, then you can of course go on to your next mission, but before you go on to the next mission, it's advisable that you adjust your loadout. Now this can come in two forms. First, just the basic equipment that you're using. You have several slots for your gear items, and these are things like throwing knives, grenades, landmines, decoys, or even a portable automatic sniper system that you can set up somewhere and control remotely. On top of that, you also have a variety of weapons that you can select. Now you have 3 weapon slots, one for your sniper rifle, one for your secondary weapon, which is either a shotgun or an assault rifle, and a slot for your pistol. And while there are actually weapon pickups in the missions themselves, just scattered around the area, or you can actually pick up weapons from fallen enemies, you're not able to keep and customize those weapons. So if you go into the loadout section and you purchase a new rifle, or a new assault rifle, or a shotgun, or a pistol, you can actually customize those and do things like add sound suppressors to them, or change the camo on them, or add a different type of scope. Or in the case of the sniper rifle, you can even get extra ammo types, things like armor-piercing rounds, or EMP rounds, or things like that. This is actually where your performance during the missions comes into sharp focus, because all of these things cost resources, whether it be just basic in-game currency, or certain tokens that you obtain from completing the objectives, or completing side activities like bounties, or even finding collectibles scattered around the area for things like intel points. And in addition to all of those that you can just complete as you're playing through the missions no matter what, there's also a series of challenges that are specific to each mission, and if you complete those challenges, then you get extra rewards on top of that. And these challenges can be anything from just getting a certain number of kills with certain types of weapons and certain types of equipment, or completing certain objectives without raising the alarm, or without taking out any enemies other than that one specific target you're being sent in to take out, or things like that. So you're definitely given an incentive for going off and completing the side activities, finding the collectibles, and of course completing the challenges, because that all directly translates into giving you more resources to spend on upgrading your loadout, or of course upgrading your character with additional abilities, things like being able to do chain takedowns, which I never really could get working very well, so your mileage might vary on that. Or enhancing the mask scan abilities so you can actually highlight opportunities in the environment, or be able to highlight where enemies are, or tag enemies automatically, or highlight where hazards might be, things like landmines that you might be stepping on inadvertently. Or of course being able to make yourself stealthier by making your footsteps quiet, or being able to blend in more with certain environments. Or even just simple things like being able to carry more ammunition, or being able to have armor plates that will give you some additional damage resistance on top of your health, which does regenerate, by the way. But the armor doesn't regenerate, so once you've lost all of your armor plates, they're gone for the rest of the mission, and they get replenished when you either restart the mission entirely, or you move on to the next one. The only thing you really need to be careful of with the character upgrades is that it functions in a sort of slot system, where each slot has 2 options, and you can only have one of those options active at any given time. So to give you a prime example, one of the slots has either the option of regenerating your stamina faster, or being able to have 100 points of armor plating. So you have to choose whether you want the armor plating, or whether you want your stamina to regenerate faster. You can unlock both, but you can only have one of them active when you go into the mission. Obviously, the more you unlock, the more options you're going to have going into each individual mission, and you can actually tailor your loadout to the specific missions you're going on. So for example, if you're going into a mission and you know it's going to be a forested area instead of a snowy one, then you can set all of the camo options so that you're harder to detect in wooded areas as opposed to snow ones. And of course, if you are going over to a snowy environment in the next mission, then you can switch all of those to be more appropriate for a snowy environment instead. And while all of this loadout and character customization is a pretty good idea, especially considering that you can unlock all of this stuff basically whenever you want as long as you have the resources, the fact that some of these upgrades are in a tree format where you have to go to the previous slot and unlock that thing first before you move on to the next one, it does mean that depending on what resources you've collected in the previous mission, you may not really be able to unlock all of the things that would really optimize your loadout for the next mission. Still, it's definitely a better system than what we had for all of that in Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, so at least there's some progress there. And speaking of progress, there's no more instant fail stealth sections in this. If you get spotted, well, you've got ways of getting out of that. You can either run away and come back later, or you can go loud and use your secondary weapon or throw grenades or whatever the case may be. And while the outcome of the mission might be really messy as a result, you can still find ways to complete every single objective in every single mission. So they've definitely learned from some of their mistakes with Ghost Warrior 3 in that regard. But what about the core mechanics? Well, that's where things get a bit messier, because the stealth system in this is more or less the same stealth system that was in Ghost Warrior 3, which is to say it's mostly off of line of sight. As long as you're not in an enemy's direct line of sight, you basically can't be spotted, and if an enemy is starting to spot you, you'll get an indicator showing up on the screen that will get larger when they get closer to spotting you and triggering the alarm, and as long as that indicator hasn't filled out, then you can break the line of sight with that particular enemy and find a place to hide, and that will reset their counter, and they will just continue going about their patrols. Enemies do also notice sound, so if you're running around shooting a gun that doesn't have a suppressor on it, then obviously they're going to notice that pretty quick. But even if you do have a suppressor on it, if you're too close to an enemy when you start shooting, they actually will still notice that and will notice that it is in fact a gunshot, which is actually pretty nice. People have this idiotic notion that suppressors, or silencers as people tend to call them, make a weapon so quiet as to be basically inaudible to anybody around you, but it's really not. In fact, in some cases, when you have a suppressor on a gun, you still need to wear hearing protection, because if you don't, then it's still so loud that it can actually cause hearing damage. And if it's a round that's going fast enough to break the sound barrier, it's still going to make that supersonic crack. Now that said, even though Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts does have the suppressors being loud enough to where an enemy close by can recognize it as a gunshot, it still adopts the movie silencer effect to some degree, because you have to be really close to an enemy for them to detect it as a gunshot. And obviously, if you shoot an enemy that's in line of sight of another enemy, then they're definitely going to notice that, and there's not much you can do about it other than taking down both of them in quick succession. Now, you might be able to find ways around this by using some of your gadgets or throwing rocks to distract enemies, but I actually didn't really use very many of the gadgets throughout the game. I used a couple of smoke grenades at one point, I used some frag grenades and throwing knives, and at one point I threw an EMP grenade at something, but that was basically it. For the rest of the game, I basically just relied on taking things fairly slow, sticking to the high grass and the brush and everything, so I made sure I was in concealment, and using my sniper rifle and my pistol, both of which I had suppressed as soon as I was able to, and just quietly taking out enemies as I needed to. And in doing that, I found that being detected was a bit of a crapshoot. Sometimes enemies would notice me almost immediately, even though I was in full concealment and I was actually fairly far away. Other times I would be in direct line of sight to an enemy, but because there was some object between me and them, even though there was clear line of sight there, it still didn't register as them detecting me. So as far as the stealth system goes, they've made basically just marginal improvements at absolute best. The AI does detect you a bit easier in this than it did in Ghost Warrior 3, but even though the enemy can spot you and start calling in mortar strikes on your position, or coordinate attacks so they basically all rush you at once and overwhelm you, they're still actually pretty dumb, so it's fairly easy to get around them, or get away from them, or just eliminate all of them. In fact, the further I got into the game, the more careless I got while I was playing it, and the latter couple of missions were basically absolute bloodbaths, where Seeker went into the area and wiped out basically all life in the area. Which is good, because I need to talk about the combat in this, because there's two ways of doing combat. Either you can be sneaky about it, or you can run in guns blazing. If you run in guns blazing, you will find very quickly that you really cannot take a lot of damage before you go down, at least not until you get the armor upgrades. Once you get those, you can actually last through a firefight or two, but it's still a pretty risky proposition because the enemy is very accurate and they can lay a lot of punishment down on you very quickly. And because your sniper rifle is effectively useless in CQB, or even really to some degree medium range unless you have time to actually line up a shot, getting into a firefight means you need to rely on your pistol and primarily your secondary weapon, which is either a shotgun or an assault rifle. I would recommend an assault rifle because most of the maps are actually fairly large, so you're not really going to get all that much mileage out of a shotgun. Now, as far as the individual assault rifles themselves, I actually didn't notice all that much difference between them. They all had automatic rates of fire, they all had very minimal recoil, and they were pretty easy to keep on target. And if you hit an enemy in the head with one, then they just drop like a sack of potatoes. Well, unless it's a heavy, because the heavies have the face shields that you need to blow off of their helmet before you can actually hit them in the head, so you need to at least lay some fire down on them before they go down. But the bigger problem with getting into a firefight in this game is that you have a very limited amount of ammunition, even once you've fully upgraded everything. Obviously, if you're playing stealthily and you are eliminating enemies from a long distance with the sniper rifle, that's not that big of a deal, because you can line up that shot and take them down in a single hit. But in the case of the assault rifles, you're going to be burning through your ammo very quickly, so you need to be pretty careful when you get into a firefight and make sure that you're making all of your shots count. And unlike in Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, where you could attach a suppressor to your assault rifles, but it would degrade over time and eventually just break, and in fact that was the case with all of the suppressors on all of the weapons in that game, in this game you can only attach suppressors to some of the pistols and some of the sniper rifles. And while this time around the suppressors don't degrade and break, them only being available for some of the sniper rifles and some of the pistols means you cannot be stealthy with your secondary weapon. If you're having to whip that thing out, it better be because a bunch of enemies are closing in on your position fast, they already know where you are, and you just need to let loose and take them all down before they take you down. So the game is definitely emphasizing stealth, but firefights in this are considerably more survivable than they were in Ghost Warrior 3, so it doesn't feel like quite as much of a punishment when you get spotted. And of course, there being no instant fail states also makes the firefights a lot more viable and makes them considerably less annoying than they were in Ghost Warrior 3, although gunplay in this is still pretty basic and really not all that satisfying. And that means that as far as core mechanics are concerned, everything pretty much falls to the sniping mechanics. They're the main draw of the game to begin with, and they are rather competent sniping mechanics. You have to compensate for gravity's effect on the bullet, you have to compensate for the wind direction as well as the wind speed, and thanks to that high-tech mask Seeker is wearing, you're given a trajectory that will show you where the bullet is going to be dropping along a path, but you do still need to adjust your aim based on not just that trajectory, but also the distance to your target, and that will be accomplished by either adjusting the scope 0 so that it will be either at the appropriate distance for where that enemy is and will be basically right on, or by simply aiming higher or lower depending on where they are. Once you've lined up your shot, you can hold your breath to steady your aim and then take that shot once you know you're ready to send that round. And if your shot was lined up correctly and you've adjusted for wind and you've adjusted for distance, then that enemy is about to get a .30 caliber lobotomy. And with the addition of the dismemberment system, the effect on target is considerably more satisfying in this than it has ever been in the entire series. It's still certainly not going to satisfy a simulation-oriented player, but for somebody who's looking for a bit of an arcadey sniping experience, a bit along the lines of, say, Sniper Elite, then it will definitely get the job done. The problem is that while that is the primary component of the game, and it does actually work quite well for the most part, it's still only one component of the game, and you really have to look at the entire package. And when you do bring the entire package together, you find that it is definitely a much better game than Sniper Ghost Warrior 3 was. This is definitely the best game in the Sniper Ghost Warrior series thus far. And while they certainly haven't hit Sniper Elite levels of quality, they finally have a solid foundation for the series going forward. Going fully open world in Sniper Ghost Warrior 3 was definitely a bad idea, but reducing it down to an open-ended mission structure instead was a fantastic move. While the implementation of the loadout system and the new character customization system wasn't quite all there yet, moving from the level-based system that they had in Ghost Warrior 3 to the open-ended resource-based system that they have now was also an excellent move. And while they still have some work to do with regards to making the gunplay a bit more satisfying while also maintaining the careful balance to make sure that this is still primarily a stealth game, and they also still have plenty of work to do in improving the stealth system and of course the enemy AI, it's still an improvement over what we had in Ghost Warrior 3. And unlike in Ghost Warrior 3, where the game was just padded with a bunch of extra content that didn't serve it, and unlike the first two games in the series, which were rather short and linear, Ghost Warrior Contracts offers a respectable amount of content while also not overstaying its welcome. This is basically 8 to 10 hours if you do basically just the story content and maybe a bit of the side content. That's about how long it took me, and I did almost all of the bounties except for I think one of them. And I didn't really concern myself with going for any of the collectibles unless I just happened to run across them as I was doing other stuff. So the game's not so short that it feels like a waste of money, but it's also not so long that it feels like it's wasting your time. And they played it smart by not releasing the game at a AAA price point, but rather by releasing it at a price point of $30 US, or your regional equivalent. And unlike Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, they didn't do a season pass. They put in a couple of extra DLCs later on down the line, one of them is just the soundtrack, but a couple of them are just some extra weapon skins, and two of them are a couple of extra weapons, specifically a pistol, which is clearly modeled after a Ruger Security 9 and amuses the living hell out of me because that is not something I would remotely consider as an operator pistol. And the other one is an extra sniper rifle, and neither of these weapons are really overpowered. They don't really have any extra benefits that put them over any of the other weapons, so they basically just end up being a matter of personal preference, and that's really the best way to handle putting extra weapons in as DLC. Apart from that, though, the substantial content that they added to the game was a multiplayer update, although it is a very simple and straightforward multiplayer mode, basically the same one that they had in Ghost Warrior 2, where it's basically just a deathmatch mode. And let me put it this way, there's a reason basically nobody plays it to the point where I couldn't even get any footage of the multiplayer, and I really can't talk about it very much, because I played Ghost Warrior 2's multiplayer, and at best it was boring, and at worst it was horribly unbalanced. Ghost Warrior Contracts multiplayer, on the other hand, from what I have witnessed by watching a few matches online, is that most people don't really play it because it is extremely slow, and basically everybody just sits in one spot and camps the entire match, which makes sense for a sniper game, but it doesn't really lend itself well to exciting and interesting multiplayer. I'm not really all that concerned about it though, because the game was designed primarily as a single-player experience, and it was released as such. They only added in the multiplayer mode later on as a free update, for the fairly small number of people who would actually be interested in that sort of thing. And clearly the multiplayer didn't really last for this game. But evaluating this as almost exclusively a single-player experience, which just happened to have a multiplayer mode tacked on later on down the line, they've done a pretty good job with it, all things considered. It's not quite into good game territory yet, but it's in territory where I can actually start recommending it if you get it on sale for a good price. I give Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts a 3 out of 5. Like I said, if you wait for a sale, you can get it for a really good price, and you can actually get some fun out of it, unlike with the previous 3 games. And if CI keeps their upward trend with this series of getting even better after this, then maybe Contracts 2 will actually be a good game, or even better than that. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm definitely curious to see how Contracts 2 turns out now. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of content I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the money from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or replacing broken equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.